Picking up immediately from the previous installment of this subseries of the larger hypothetical invasion documentary series using fourth-generation warfare doctrines within the South Central invasion sector of the USA, the 83rd PLA Group Army, as well as the 36th PAP Brigade of its 4th Corps from its 2nd Mobile Contingent, were on the march already, having left their CCP regime properties and began making for their initial objectives, which consisted of engaging the various military units where they stood, as they had gathered intel by ascertaining the location of these forces through cyber warfare capabilities of hacking into the financial transactions when it came to leasing certain properties for these units and using that to input as their targeting data for their weapon systems, as well as also putting it into their war plan as far as the movements of their forces moving against the American units that were on the map located throughout the metro area. As these forces would also crack down on any type of reactionary elements, namely the civilians, but also any local paramilitary forces that dared to challenge them as they advanced on their objectives, they would equally respond with crushing firepower against said reactionary elements. And that was also put into the war planning as a contingency, as it was well understood that parts of the country were better armed than were some others. And Texas, of course, per capita was the most armed state in the land. And there would be ample reactionary armed civilians trying to put up resistance against the incoming invasion forces. Not only was it the PLA Ground Forces or the PLA Army, but it was also the PLAN, or the People's Liberation Army Navy, contributing not just its sea-based forces, but also its Marines in the form of its 1st Marine Brigade, landing in Texas City, Texas, on the coast. And the People's Armed Police, a fanatical regime loyalist paramilitary element of the CCP regime, would be also contributing their part to this invasion, as these were very savage forces that specialized in crushing uprisings and would utilize these skills against the reactionary armed civilians to the hilt. But make no mistake about it, they were also, as a parallel military force, militarily armed and equipped, and could also take on enemy military units just the same, as the PAP not only had anti-armor capabilities, but some of its forces even possessed artillery, light armor, and in very rare cases, there were even some heavily armored PAP forces. But the standard PAP forces, albeit as light as they were still highly effective and very combat reliable. And they were very gung-ho out of all the different Chinese forces involved in the invasion. The PLAN Marines, however, were also quite a gung-ho force, and they, being tasked with the seizure of some very important objectives just to the south of the main metro area in Texas City, Texas, where the previous installment left off, were now expanding their bridgehead just as the PLAN naval forces and the Russian VVS, or their Air Force assets in the form of their Su-27s equipped with the Kibini system, the same system that jammed up the USS Donald Cook in the Black Sea, causing it to basically be switched off, for a lack of a better term, were now doing the same in this specific area. While the Arleigh-Burke class destroyer had essentially been jammed again, and thus was destroyed by missiles fired from the Renhai-class stealth cruisers of the PLAN, who fired their YJ-21 anti-ship missiles at the vessel and essentially, for a lack of a better term, blew it out of the water. The Arleigh-Burke could have been a very dangerous foe indeed, hence the reason why it was a prime target. This vessel boasted a 127mm main gun. It had a 20mm close-in weapon system, or essentially a 20mm Gatling gun. It had 96 missile cells, which was certainly nothing to bat an eye at, as the saying went, and was equipped with the RIM-161 anti-ballistic missile missiles. They had Tomahawk cruise missiles, RIM-66Ms, and RIM-156s, which were surface-to-air missiles. And of course, they also had the Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and they had 2 sets of triple torpedo pods, making this a very dangerous combatant. Therefore, it was of the PLAN's top priority to destroy this vessel, and it also could carry 2 Helos in the form of their 2 Seahawks. They're Helos of the MH-60R varieties, which were anti-submarine warfare helicopters. These were very dangerous, and the Coast Guard cutter itself, the largest of the 4 present in the area, which was the Legend class, just slightly off-map and to the northeast, would be destroyed by the USUN deep-sea kamikaze drone being tested in combat for the first time, as it had been already tested in non-combat conditions, but now would veer off and off the map to destroy the Legend-class cutter, as that was equipped with a 57mm gun, which was a massive gun for a Coast Guard vessel, of course, and would need to be destroyed, as that could pose a threat as well. But the USUN would indeed take care of that threat, as this Sentry-class cutter was hit by a YJ-21 anti-ship missile. The Dolphin helicopter from the Legend-class Coast Guard cutter was hit by a surface-to-air missile coming from one of the Renhai-class ships, which was an HQ-9 surface-to-air missile, the ship-based version. As the YJ-21s hit the different vessels in the form of the Arleigh-Burke class destroyer, the Coast Guard cutter present in this area right here, the Sentry class, and the USUN went and dealt with the Legend class, which was also being engaged by other systems as well, such as YJ-21s, as it was simultaneously being engaged along with the other vessels, because this needed to be carried out quickly. The other vessel was carried out, the destruction of the other Sentry cutter was carried out by one of the Song-class subs that had snuck into the sound side of the harbor between the mainland and Galveston Island and fired off 2 of its large 533mm torpedoes, which basically annihilated the Sentry-class cutter, and it would remain within the sound side to patrol while the troops were being landed safely within their newly established bridgehead, as the 2 LCACs had just dropped off another company, as there was already another company off map, the first troops that had made their landing and seized control of an area of the port, as they came in with their vehicles and troops and stormed ashore with the aid of the Z-9WA attack helicopters utilized by the PLAN Marines. And they fired their dual 23mm cannons, they fired their 57mm rockets when necessary, as they each carried 2 of these rocket pods, and they also carried 8 AKD-10 millimeter-wave radar-guided missiles that were extremely accurate and could lock on to a target and follow a moving target, as it was radar-guided. And they came in guns blazing, landed their forces, and stormed ashore, along with their ISR assets, sweeping the area for enemies and relaying that data back to the central AI system, which processed all the real-time battlefield data, updated the forces on the ground with their combat data links, as again the NCOs carried their own small combat data link, which was steadily updated with the fresh updates through the ISR network, and the AI processed data, as the AI also processed many other fields of data, such as the capabilities of weapons and the angle and traverse and use of weapons in order to use them safely to mitigate any type of friendly fire casualties, as mentioned before, cutting it down to almost zero. This technology was revolutionary and changing the face of warfare, and the AI system also influenced the targeting of the AI settings on the loitering munitions, which had their own AI targeting network, which was also updated and controlled by the central AI system and used the ISR collected data to change or update the targeting on the AI settings on these loitering munitions in order for them to seek out and prioritize specific targets. Again, this was very revolutionary in warfare, and it would aid the troops on the ground drastically and would allow for them to make decisions and respond in a more flexible manner than had ever before been possible in warfare. As the forces in their Lynx VP4 all-terrain vehicles, which were just like a miniature gun truck essentially, they even had an artillery version of the Lynx as well as even an air defense version, surprisingly, which were new iterations of this vehicle. But this was the reconnaissance lightly armored vehicle that could carry 8 troops at the maximum, which was the greater part of a squad, or essentially just a small squad. Although it was a tight fit, the gun turret was remote controlled. It was a Jianshe 12.7 millimeter Gatling gun, which could lay down a high rate of fire and put a lot of lead on an enemy target. It was the CS LM5 Gatling gun. As the troops were now rapidly seizing control of the port area and preparing to land their heavier forces by unloading them after the cranes and equipment were captured intact, making the process go far faster and more smooth than ever before possible. If they planned originally on using their LCACs, that would have taken substantially longer, or using the vehicles with their amphibious capabilities by gradually having to drop them into the water from specially designed ships, it would be much faster to use the cranes to unload their heavier forces, as in their 3 different combined arms battalions, their heavy, medium, and light, as well as also their artillery and air defense battalions, and their combat support battalion as well, as all of these battalions would have to make landfall, leaving their headquarters company remaining out to sea until the entire port area was fully under the PLAN control of the Marines. The vessels out at sea would be steadily firing missiles, not only in support of the troops operating in the Texas City, Texas area of their own Marines, but also giving them an umbrella of air defense cover with their HHQ-9s from the Renhai class, as well as also aiding combat much further inland, and even also the battle that was now unfolding down in the McAllen area with the externals crossing the border there. They were firing cruise missiles in the form of the YJ-18Bs from the 4 different submarines present, and the submarine now patrolling the harbor would also end up firing its YJ-18Bs in support of the operations going on further inland as well. These cruise missiles came from the Renhai vessels, and they were aimed at these Port Authority buildings that were being utilized as the command center for the defense forces, which were a hodgepodge of naval security specialists, Coast Guard forces, and also the Port Authority forces, which were now utilizing these structures as their essentially command posts, which were already discovered by the coalition and the PLAN had fired their CJ-10 cruise missiles, their land attack cruise missiles from their Renhai class ships at these buildings, with a YJ-18B from one of the Song class subs hitting this one right here and turning it into a crater and horribly gutting this building and this building on either side. As the forces now, with the air assault troops being freshly landed, there being a platoon here, there's a platoon here and a platoon here. These troops were now beginning to fan out to secure the LZ. They landed, they got into their diamond formation as they exited each side of their Z-18 utility helicopter, which was their transport helo. And this one formed into a line formation and entered this building and would use this building as a OP, or their observation post, outpost. And they would also use this building as an OP as well. This diamond formation would move and establish a line formation along the tracks. This wedge that came out of this one formed into a wedge is bounding here and going to form another line along the tracks, while this platoon of air assault troops is now beginning to clear buildings. Rolling T formation going for this building, another rolling T going for the same building, this one in a line formation going for this building, clearing it before moving out alongside this building while they clear this building. This rolling T moved to the side of this building while these two then moved into this building while this one remained outside and then went to this side of the building. There's a lot of movement, and then this one exited and went into to clear this building before bounding across the street to clear this building along with this rolling T that was outside of this building, moving around and then moving in as the two squads that had gone in here both tactically crossed the street together, with one watching the corner while the other bounded. Then they watched the corner while they bounded across and stopped right here, while this one that was on the side of the building now bounded across the street and stopped right here. As all of this movement was going on, this platoon was moving into this building. This squad right here is part of this platoon. This rolling T went up in between the buildings to watch the outside of them, while this squad went in this one went in this one. This squad went over here to guard the flanks and went in to clear this building, and then they went into this building while this helo went over here and joined this helo, this attack helicopter that was firing over here in support of their forces, who now, as this squad went in here and moved over here with this rolling T now crossing the street in between these buildings to guard the outside of them while they cleared the buildings, this squad went in here along with this wedge going in here. This squad that went in here that bounded across the street went in this building as well with these other two squads, this one and this one. These three all ended up inside of here along with this rolling T going in as well. So there's now 4 squads in here with these two outside that tactically crossed the street as mentioned previously, with this rolling T moving up here and stopping outside this building while 2 squads left and went into this building, and the other 2 left and went into this building while these 2 squads moved up here, tactically again crossing the street. At this point, this MRAP had been destroyed, this Max Pro MRAP, because it had already since been fired upon by the recon forces, who now, as of this moment, had no troops dismounted as of yet from their vehicles. As this company had freshly landed with their Lynx all-terrain vehicles, they moved up to the railroad tracks, and while all these movement to clear these buildings was going on to guard the flanks of their operation, they were mutually supporting one another in this battlefield, they opened fire at this MRAP and lit this thing up completely with their Jianshe Gatling 12.7 millimeter machine guns. And the attack helo over here also fired upon it with its dual 23mm armor-piercing cannons and destroyed it as well. And as that happened, these vehicles then moved up here and held their position here. But now they were taking fire from this MRAP. But this helo in this spot here had fired one of its AKD-10 radar-guided missiles while also firing its 23mm dual 23mm cannon at it, autocannon, and destroyed this thing while the vehicles had taken fire and turned their turret to fire back after already having had destroyed this one. As all these movements were going on, this movement was going on with the vehicle. This helo, by the time it moved here, was actually beginning to take fire from the Americans on the ground, because over here in this area, littered with all kinds of containers, the Port Authority people, naval security specialists, and even also Coast Guard forces with all their small arms began to fire their small arms at the helo and had badly damaged it, causing it to have to limp back to the Type 07 helicopter carrier. They had taken position along the tracks, as well as others running amid all the containers that littered this area, and were firing up at the helo from their containers. And the helo, while it did manage to get off a good shot and destroy this MRAP for these recon vehicles of this recon company right here moving through the area, they had to limp off all the way back to their Type 075 helicopter carrier, which is where the Recon Battalion and the Air Asslt Battalion originated from. They had to go back for repairs. But while that happened, this helo had moved into position here after they had left and began to light these forces up. These forces here, as this platoon of recon vehicles moved here and fired their heavy turrets, their Gatling 12.7 millimeter their Gatling guns. These are very powerful. They fired these at a high rate of fire into this area right here, along with the helo-based fire from their 23 millimeter armor-piercing autocannons, which shredded these forces up. This MRAP got annihilated because by the time it got here, it was starting to open fire on this helo, along with the small arms from these forces, which caused it to take some damage, although it was doing the typical movements helos do to avoid small arms fire. It got hit and it had to leave. So it got out of there quick, as fast as it could. Well, this one moved in and started lighting these guys up horribly. And these guys here had already since been lit up by these forces firing across at them, although they tried to take cover behind the tracks. Eventually, these vehicles all lined up on the tracks and laid down fire down on all these forces, and these forces completely wiping them out as the helo wiped these out. And as these guys moved into position, they began to take heavy fire, which was shredding through a lot of the containers they were trying to hide amid, causing them to have to go around and take even more fire as this helo pursued them moving into this area and then lit them up as they got here and finished them all off. The firepower was devastating. And this MRAP was destroyed by the helo moving through the area, firing its very powerful 23 millimeter autocannons, dual autocannons at these, and shredding it up. And they would continue to hover in this area to provide support before later moving on. And they would do this to support their recon forces and their own air assault troops that were now operating on the ground. As the QRF forces, as mentioned in the previous installment, were moving into the area, these helos let off their 57 millimeter rocket pods, blasting an entire part of this building, completely gutting this end of this building as some of the rockets had splashed into it, with the rest slamming into these MRAPs. And also an AKD-10 was fired, along with all the 57 millimeter rocket fire and the chain gun fire, just shredding these vehicles up. They didn't even make it by the time these 8 MRAPs got here. They were all completely annihilated by this highway exit and entry point, and under this highway bridge. They were coming down the street here, and they all got shredded up. This one also fired an AKD-10 at this, before these two helos had linked up together, as indicated by this, and then they all flew over this area here. And they begun to take some fire as they were being engaged by the green here, but they were also firing back, and they had destroyed these vehicles, these two MRAPs, as they had moved up here, laying down fire in return against these helos. The helos had fired back and destroyed both of them as they were moving up together. The gunner was facing backwards, this one was facing forwards. As they moved up, they were destroyed. But as all of this was going on, the recon forces and air assault troops were still moving up as they had taken these buildings and cleared them all. These two squads moving across now broke up into one squad going in here, one going over here. As these other two squads leaving, one went in this way and one went in this way, so now you have three in here, and then you have three coming out and taking fire from these forces that moved up over here. So there was a firefight right here. This MRAP had already since been destroyed by the combo of the recon vehicles firing their very powerful Jianshe CS LM5 12.7 millimeter chain guns at them, as well as now the dismounted air assault troops firing their Type 69 rocket propelled grenades. Their barrel fired, beneath their barrel, their tube fired 35 millimeter grenades, throwing hand grenades, firing their QBZ-95 rifles. I mean, this firefight by the tracks was now very intense between these forces and these, as the firefight was now picking up in intensity. This squad had moved in this building and was firing from in this building at these forces here. And this MRAP, again, had been destroyed by this AKD, but these vehicles moved up here and were now assisting and laying down fire against these forces that were now laid up behind these tracks, using these tracks as a sort of ad hoc trench-like system. By the time these forces were here, these buildings had since been destroyed, and this MRAP along with it, it didn't get out of the way quick enough, but these guys had already since gotten out of the way. But by the time they got here and were now engaged in a firefight along with these forces, it was now over because these vehicles were laying down fire on them, along with these troops firing out this building. As you can see, the building is being engaged. That's why there's a bunch of green around it. When they exited the building, they were being engaged still, because these guys over here were also firing at them like they were firing back and forth with them. And these troops over here, these air assault troops over here that had come from this building and gone in this one, had exited along with those watching the outside of the building tactically, bounding with them, communicating by radio as they went through the building, moving up alongside them as was standard practice. As they all got out here from the building, they were taking fire from these guys, as well as at the time from some of these guys, but they had returned fire along with these troops and had finished them off together. They had fired, they vectored their fire in a diagonal form and finished them off with a combo of hand grenades, small arms fire, their QJB-201 light machine guns, their QBZ-95 rifles, their 35 millimeter tube fired grenades, their anti-personnel rounds for their Type 69 Chinese RPGs, also their anti-tank missiles in the form of their HJ-08s, which they typically were going to save for some of the heavier vehicles like the MRAPs. But at this point in time, the attack helos were doing an excellent job of suppressing vehicles and a lot of enemy personnel, even though there were still some that made it to the tracks to put up a fight against these troops. But the helos would also fire down on these troops to assist the ground forces in wiping them out. As these guys had fired on this building when this squad went in here, the squad fired back out along with the fire coming from the helos, assisting them in this effort here, and the fire coming from here. So another interlocking fields of fire, tactically, interlocking fields of fire where these forces were wiped out. It was as simple as that. And as these forces had fled the area down here while these guys were trying to hold the area for them and the vehicles were laying down fire on them, this squad moving around this way, this rolling T that came around through here, or I'm sorry, this group of vehicles that came around through here with this squad that cleared this building coming through here, crossing after the vehicles had already gone here and coming around here, they had come around the corner here And they had taken some fire from these guys earlier, and also these forces here, but they had laid down fire along with the vehicle-based fire, mutually supporting each other. The mutual support between the vehicles and the troops and the helos wiped these guys out. As these guys crossed the tracks and got to this point here, they were being attacked by the attack helicopter, the Z9WA, that got here and laid down heavy fire upon them. And by that point, as that had occurred, the vehicles were now again on the move, while these troops that crossed the tracks were also on the move themselves, with 5 vehicles going this way and the other 5 going this way out of this group of 10 vehicles right here, these 2 platoons of vehicles. 5 went this way up here and the other 5 proceeded down here. And they had wiped out these guys on the way with the attack helicopters and the vehicles laying down heavy firepower on these forces as they move through the area. And also these troops guarding this gate right here that led into this port right here were attacked by the helos flying over the area, as this was this helo right here laying down heavy fire on these forces, and also these forces here as well. In addition to the forces guarding the gate, which again were Naval Security, Port Authority, and Coast Guard forces all in this particular area adjacent to the highway where the bridge goes over the sound side of the harbor here on the other side of Galveston Island, between Galveston Island and the mainland. And then there's also the railroad that goes under this part of the bridge. And the helos, after having helped the vehicles fire at all these forces and wipe them out, and also wiping out this MRAP on the way, as a squad went through this area clearing these buildings, they had emerged right here, which they held their position. This was the squad that came all the way from over here, this squad that went through all those buildings to assist the vehicles, had entered the port right here after the helos and the vehicles over here had taken out all these forces. They had moved through these buildings to clear them out and make sure there were no enemies present, as this was a gate into this part of the port here. They went through and cleared all these port buildings and exited right here. And the vehicles, as the helos moved up here across the highway, the vehicles now moved in here, and they now broke up into different vehicles. One went this way, one went this way, one went this way, and they went around this way. They let their troops out of their vehicles to clear these buildings, and they cleared everything around here as the vehicles all lined up in this area right here. They did their little fishbone formation with their vehicles before they dismounted troops, who went around and cleared this entire area. They cleared this whole part of the port. They cleared the crane. They cleared the docks over here. They cleared that crane. They made sure all these KIAs and destroyed vehicles were completely gone so that there wouldn't be any threat of attack once they had moved through the area. They cleared all the buildings. Then 2 of their squads from these, dismounted from the 5 vehicles, the 5 Lynx vehicles, were now moving beneath the railroad bridge. And as they got here, other actions were going on up here. Again, there's so much going on, it is extremely difficult to convey it all in a rational order, although it will be attempted. The other 5 vehicles moved through this area right here. They went underneath the highway bridge right here, the highway overpass, the underpass, where the exit and the 2 exits were. And they had already had their squads cross the tracks and clear these buildings, including this gutted building right here. These were already destroyed by these incoming CJ-10 cruise missiles, but this one wasn't hit by any missiles, but it was being cleared out just to ensure that there were no enemy personnel in here. And as the helos had already moved through this area right up here, the vehicles were now going under the highway, stopping here temporarily and laying down fire on these forces along with the helos. And the helos and vehicles would be mutually supporting one another. As they got to the corner, their lead vehicle was spraying these forces with their chain gun, along with the helos hovering around the area, firing. And there were even a few of these loitering munitions fired from a few Marines of the recon forces that were specially trained to operate the single tube systems of these. And these would end up hitting two MRAPs, well, one MRAP, one right here, and a group of troops moving up the side of the tracks right here. They would hit them as they tried to flee the area. And the oil refinery that the forces wanted to capture the most for the time being was the Valero oil refinery, a major objective of the Chinese forces, as they had sent two squads beneath the tracks, beneath the bridge along the tracks. They were going to infiltrate from the south and get into the facility that way. And they were already fighting enemy personnel as they had come under the tracks. This squad went in to clear this building, and they would fire and ambush these forces on the outside of the building and these forces would fire back as they crossed. And they would eliminate these forces from inside the building, as these forces were essentially trying to guard the area behind this fence line right here. And the helos were assisting them in this. They were right here. There was a helicopter hovering over that area right here, a single helo, and they were firing their 23 millimeter chain gun at them. Although they took some fire, as indicated they were being engaged, they were bobbing and weaving to avoid the small arms fire while these squads assisted them in finishing these forces off. This one firing at this, while this squad in here was firing out the windows before they bounded and cleared this building, with this squad outside, again as per standard operating procedure, moving up to the corner along the tracks as the helo remained in position and prepared to move up if needed, whereas this squad, upon clearing this building, bounded across the tracks and cleared this building, while this squad remained outside and moved along these tanks right here, these massive drums, these massive storage tanks, and moved right up here to the corner and was laying down fire here. While all that was going on, the forces, the vehicle-based forces, after having fired around the corner at this MRAP here, this one blocking the gate, and these troops right here, these different forces, whether Coast Guard, naval forces, naval security specialists, or the Port Authority troops, they had slaughtered them with heavy volumes of vehicle-based 12.7 millimeter Gatling gun fire coming from their remote-controlled turret and of the lead vehicle, and they completely sprayed these forces, as the attack helicopter was aiding as well, as they stayed in this position, and they were laying down heavy fire on all these forces from their current position. And they weren't just sitting still hovering, they were moving around in this general area, trying to bob and weave and stay out of the way of small arms fire. As that was happening, these two American forces right here went into this building to get out of the way. They were basically panicked at this point. And as this group was running off, because the helo was laying down so much firepower, you can see they're being engaged, but they just barely were missed, and they got into this building right here. This being part of the large Marathon oil refinery, just literally to the north and off this map. It was also a very big oil refinery, like the Valero one. As this MRAP had been destroyed by this loitering munition, and this loitering munition continued on, as these two were equipped with HE warheads. This one continued on and destroyed these four fleeing personnel right here. As these personnel moved to the south early on, they moved here, before then moving here, as they were now battling between the two squads moving up from this way, one firing at them from outside of this building. They were sitting in this building firing at these guys. As they fired an HJ-08 anti-tank missile. They fired their rocket-propelled grenade anti-personnel rounds. They fired 35 millimeter grenades. They fired their small arms. I mean, they lit these guys up. They were all KIA'd. There was a squad of 8 of these naval security specialists moving up in a double column formation. As they got here, they were liquidated by the time they got to the fence. The MRAP was destroyed by an HJ-08 from this guy around the corner after they lit these guys up from inside this building. They had already lit these guys up. And the attack helo in the area was hovering higher up to get a better shot, and they fired upon the MRAP as well and these troops. So they were supporting them from this area right here. They were well within range of all their weapons, so they just lit them up with the 23mm armor-piercing ammunition and shredded these forces to pieces along with the small arms fire, as well as also fired at these forces here. The helos played a big role in supporting the air assault and recon troops in their operations. These two squads came from the recon platoon that let off the troops in this area, the dismounted troops, to secure this part of the port. But they also sent two of their squads from their platoon to assist in the capture of this massive oil facility, the Valero facility. So now, as the helo here was laying down enormous volumes of firepower, I mean, they hadn't even have fired their rocket pods yet, but they would end up doing so because they would light these forces up with their rocket pods, but they would do it in such a way where they did minimal damage to these buildings because they wanted these facilities as much intact as possible. It would destroy the fencing, but they would liquidate these forces right here. As these vehicles came in, they were taking fire from these forces here, but they had laid down heavy fire along with the attack helicopter fire coming in as well, just destroying this MRAP and these two troops. These were like just your Port Authority people right here. These were actual naval security people and Coast Guard forces guarding the gate. They had been already destroyed. The vehicles, the 5-vehicle platoon, broke through the fence right here. They were engaged and they returned fire, destroyed these guys. This was destroyed already by the attack helicopter. By the time they got here, they dismounted their squads. They had 3 go in this building, the main building right here, clear it. They had 2 go in here, clear this building, while the 1 came out and held their position in a line formation along the tracks. These guys retreated into a building because the rockets were being fired from the rocket pod of the attack helo in this area, which blasted this MRAP as well as these troops and destroyed the fence line right here. I mean, the rockets splashed right along the street right here and lit these guys up, along with the 23mm armor-piercing chain gun. All these guys were gone, and the vehicle-based fire, too, came in from the side. So there was fire coming from the air, coming down on them from the rocket pods, and there was fire coming from the 12.7mm Gatling CS LM5 Gatling 12.7mm machine gun made by Jianshe Industries. So they had a lot of heavy firepower that they wielded against these forces. And now that the squads were beginning to go through and clear these facilities, the squads of these recon troops, the other recon troops from the other platoon, the 2 squads sent in from the south, had by now held their position in this building while the other squad was now beginning to move up through this area after they had worked together with their local helicopter asset in liquidating all these forces as they moved into the area. And by now, the last squad here from around the corner, after they took care of these enemies, they went and held this building while the other squads moved through the facility and gradually cleared it, tactically bounding and covering from the outside and the inside as they coordinated their actions by radio as they moved up on the outside, as they cleared through the building on the inside, because that was the way it would be done in case enemies tried to flee. You could intercept them, or if needed, you could go in and assist. And eventually they went in after this building was thoroughly swept by this squad. And then they both went and cleared this one together because now they knew that this squad held this building and this squad held this building, so their flanks on this side were secure. So they went in and cleared this last building, and they then broke up with one squad clearing this building, one clearing this one, and then they cleared this one and held their position and encountered and captured these enemies right here. These 4 right here were captured inside this building. They were taken alive. And then this squad right here, clearing this building, went through here and then held their position here. They now had full control over the Valero oil refinery. It was now theirs, this massive oil refinery, because again, this is a 3.5 mile by 3 mile map north to south. This is a big map. And now that the Valero oil facility was in the hands of the PLAN forces, the forces that had gone into part of the Valero facility would be dealt with as the PLAN continually ferried in more of their recon battalion, because there were more companies of it that needed to be brought in, as in there were 20 of these vehicles per company, plus they also had some of their non-armored all-terrain vehicles as well. They had more air assault troops that could be brought in from their air assault battalion. Again, they only had a few full companies here. They had one company in just this area and another one off map as they expanded their bridgehead and completely seized control of the entire port from off map all the way up. And now the oil refineries were being captured one by one. Now Valero was in the hands of the PLAN, as the threat from the sea was completely neutralized early on. That was some of the first moves in the opening of the invasion. All the vessels were neutralized through electronic warfare jamming. All the satellite-based data networks, the military networks, GPS, all the communications that is satellite-based and internet-based through the military networks, because it was connected into the internet, was all hacked and destroyed through the cyber warfare hacking, as well as the hard kill anti-satellite weapons. It completely neutralized everything that the American military depended on as far as communications and guidance for their weapon systems with the GPS. All of that was gone. So the electronic warfare jamming got all of the redundant systems, as in their systems that were radio-based, radar-based, all of that. So anything that wasn't connected to the internet or dependent upon satellite was handled by the Kibini systems and their targeted electromagnetic jamming systems. While the USUN was not only being used in the Houston battle for the first time, but it was being used in other areas to actually go after American subs too, not just surface combatants, because there were a lot of new weapons being tested in this invasion, as mentioned at the very beginning of the entire hypothetical fourth generation warfare documentary series. All of these weapons are real, and these are all now being tested for the first time. And the PLAN had conducted their large, savage missile strikes, not just in Texas City against the local forces and their command centers for the Port Authority people with their Port Authority offices and their nerve center for their local security forces, but they were hitting other areas in Texas City as well, because there were also more security forces personnel than just the 260 located in just this specific area. There were more off the map as well, and any of the buildings being utilized by them were, of course, targeted for missile strikes, where they were hit by airstrikes, like tactical airstrikes, or they were also completely raided by PLAN troops as they moved through the areas and cleared buildings one after another, and thoroughly seized control over the entire port and ensured that they would now be able to unload all of their heavier forces from their brigade. So the entire PLAN 1st Marine Brigade would be landed ashore, minus its headquarters company, and it's also its service support company would remain out to sea as well. But eventually they too would come on land. Once all of Texas City, Texas had been thoroughly secured by the PLAN 1st Marine Brigade. Their job now, as they gradually seized the most important parts of Texas City, Texas, would be to continually fan out and clear the entire city and establish the port, or consolidate their control over the port, rather, to be able to begin to use the cranes to unload their heavier battalions and their equipment which would be a very simple and easy way to achieve that task instead of doing it the other way, whether using their LCACs to continually have to ferry them in when they could simply just dock their cargo ships and use the cranes, which would be much faster. Now they would continue to fan out and consolidate also at the same time their control over the captured port facilities, which they managed to capture essentially completely intact. Almost nothing important as it pertained to the ports themselves had been destroyed. They achieved their aims. They had seized control over all the cranes, the docks, everything they needed to unload the rest of their brigade. And this port, for colonization operations, would end up as a prime port for sending refined oil exports back to China, and also importing things they needed for their colonial efforts. As the new red zone would be established in downtown Houston, Texas City, Texas, with all of its refineries and port facilities, would end up being a miniature red zone of its own, similar to the American Green Zone. And many of the buildings had also been captured intact relating to the port itself and would be put to good use under their new colonial overlords. As the casualties in this particular battle were 281 KIA'd from the destroyer, from the Arleigh-Burke class, as it was destroyed by the YJ-21 anti-ship missiles. There were 98 KIAs amongst the Coast Guard that were in the cutters, so there was 389 sea casualties. And on land, there was 180 KIAs among the Americans, 50 wounded in action, but all of them were captured. Only 30 managed to flee the area for the time being, but they would end up being KIA'd or captured, and many of the captured would end up being WIA'd because they didn't want to give up without a fight. And the Chi-Coms, they had a badly damaged attack helicopter from the small arms fire directed at it early on as it hovered over the area, and it had to limp back to get repaired, and it would be repaired, but they also had some KIAs amongst their forces. There were 8 PLAN Marines that were KIA'd amongst their Air Asslt Recon troops, and there were 12 WIAs, 2 of which were serious and had to be medevaced out by their Z-18 utility helicopters and returned to their naval vessels for urgent medical treatment because their condition was severe. The fighting here was actually of a savage nature, with the firefights, the power of the different crew-serve weapons involved, whether it was the American 50 cal or the Chinese CS LM5 Gatling 12.7 millimeter machine gun, or whether it was even the W85 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, and also the anti-tank weapons, the helicopter-based weapons, which were very powerful, and also even just the standard small arms and Type 69 RPGs, and the HJ-08s were very potent anti-tank missiles. It was a very destructive fight. I mean, there were even buildings that caught fire in some places because of flammables being ignited due to all the crossfire that occurred. It was very destructive. But the most important thing for the PLA was that all of the port was captured intact, and the oil refinery, the Valero refinery itself, was also captured intact. And the biggest threat in the area, being the Arleigh-Burke class destroyer, had been neutralized and gone, completely eliminated. In the next portion of the Battle of Houston will be the battle that broke out at the Ellington Field, the Joint Base Ellington, which contained 5 out of 6 of the America's different military branches. as they all had a presence at this facility, and Ellington had been instrumental in bringing in certain forces from outside of the state to augment the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment, who was tasked with security in the Houston metro area. More to come in the next installment.